Just don't talk so loud.
I won't talk so
Okay, here we are. Hey, we're live. All right. Yeah, we're all just really picking it here today. A few technical issues and a few things like that, but we're getting it straightened out. Welcome to the Designer Show, you guys. This is Dan Baumann with Chief Experts, on with John and Robin, and our special guest today is Ron Wirtz. So, Ron, I'm going to let you in a few minutes give everybody a little heads up on your background and what you do and
Mhm.
kind of why we invited you here today. I'll say that I was fortunate enough to attend an ARI event that Ron spoke at. I think it was last spring or this
It
spring
was,
of this
correct.
year,
Correct.
and I absolutely loved what he had to say, and it just like really hit home. And it's like I asked him if he'd come on our show, and here he is today. So welcome, Ron. And I see Renee has showed up today now as well. Hey, Renee, how are you? Okay, so a couple quick housekeeping things. We've got a survey that we want you to take anytime. So I'll leave the thing scroll on the bottom of the screen so you can take that survey. And for those of you that are watching this after the show, I don't know, the link may or may not work. So, I mean, if you're watching the recording, so if you want to try it after that, yeah, you might be able to add to the survey and we can check it out again a little bit later. So, it'd be nice to just keep getting your feedback on these questions that Ron's going to talk about today. So, if you're on this page where you see this stuff, okay, the link to that survey is also right here. Okay, so you can click on that and they'll take you right to the survey. And we appreciate if you'd fill in the answers, and then Ron will discuss some of those things as we're going through the presentation. Just a couple of quick things. The summit's filling up pretty quickly, so you guys might want to check into that. I wouldn't wait too long. It's filling a lot faster than I thought it would. I'm just thrilled. This is going to be a really cool event. So please check it out. We do have a 3-day course coming up in Minnesota here in Bloomington, second week of December, 12th to the 14th. So please check that out. You can hit the register now button and that'll take you to the page where you can learn all about that. And then the Robin and Renee was just on the lighting class yesterday and a ton of great information. I learned a lot because I've never been big into the rendering and the lighting in Chief. So Renee, thanks for being on the show yesterday. That was really helpful. So if you're interested, we're done with the class now. So it's all there for immediate access. Robin had 3 shows of just fantastic information about how to do lighting in kitchens and baths. So Robin, thanks for doing that.
my pleasure.
That was some of your best stuff ever. So
Thank you.
so well done. And so you guys can get it. I did set it up so until November 22nd, you can still get $50 off the on-demand course. So 50 off lighting class would be the coupon code. Check it out. I think you will really enjoy it. So it really turned out well. All right, so let's jump back to our host, Ron. Ron, I'm going to let you tell everybody about yourself and what you do. So have at it, please. And then you can just jump into your presentation.
Sounds great.
So,
Great. Thanks for the invite, Dan. Thanks for the introduction. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk with you. As Dan mentioned, we had the opportunity to meet back in May at an ARI event. I do a lot of public speaking, and it's really good to get in front of construction folks. We pay a lot of attention to the construction sector. It's a bellwether that we think, and so we pay a lot of attention. We do a lot of tracking of it. So I'm always happy to get in front of construction firms that can tell us a little bit about what they're seeing. Normally, I do so. My job as regional outreach director, I am. It's more art than science, but I'm there trying to tell our president Neil Kashkari what's happening in the real time economy. As I mentioned, there's a lot of interpretation, but I do a lot of outreach to businesses so you can help me inform Neil about what's happening in the economy. Normally, when I get in front of a business office or a business audience, excuse me, I usually am polling them in an interactive way during my presentations. So I've had a little bit of technical difficulty because of my high security bank laptop didn't mesh very well with the platform here. So I had to go to a personal computer. Dan has done a Herculean effort to try to still get me some of that insight from you. Might be a little bit clunkier than we all would prefer, but I'd appreciate it if you could take that survey. And Dan, at the appropriate slide where I have it in my presentation, he's going to pop up the survey results that are relevant in that to that particular question. So hopefully we can do a little bit of information sharing, because whenever I'm in front of a business audience, I want to take information, but I want to share the same information with you so you learn what I learned. Okay, so let me get into my presentation here. And Dan, stop me at any point because I'm
Oops.
kind of paying attention to my screen and not what's maybe going off on the side. If
No,
there's something you need me to stop for, just give me a little verbal cue, please.
no, yeah,
Before,
you're good. Right now, it's the disclaimer is on the screen.
okay, great.
Can you hide that little StreamYard thing on your screen? Just click that.
I
Yeah, there you
can.
go.
Great.
Perfect.
And then, Dan, maybe
Okay.
you should go over how to get to the survey and stuff real quick.
You bet.
People that
Again,
just came in.
if you're on the page where you're watching this on our website, there's a red link that says "Take Ron Survey," or you could just type in the URL at the bottom of the screen. I think you might have to use all caps. You got to type it just the way it's showing there.
Actually, you don't have to use all caps. You can
Okay,
just,
you don't. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So yeah, please take that survey, and then as Ron goes through the presentation, we'll look at the answer. It's really easy. It's nothing. It's not a big deal, but it's just kind of getting where your guys are at right now.
it's
So
seven or eight or nine questions, something like that.
yeah, it's
I
really
believe
7
yeah.
questions.
So before I get into the actual presentation, I have to give you my bozo slide. So basically, the views that I give you here are mine and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System. So in case I say something that's inaccurate or foolish, you have to blame the clown and not the circus. So what am I going to talk about today? So I'm going to give you kind of a snapshot of the current state of the economy. Now that's a very big task in 30 minutes or so. So I'm going to kind of try to hit the highlights. Generally speaking, demand is slowing, particularly for construction. But we also see some underlying factors that really suggest some stamina, maybe stamina that we frankly maybe didn't even expect at this stage. We're seeing really kind of surprisingly strong job growth. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I'll talk a little bit about the fact that it could be even stronger if we were able to find some more labor. Speaking of labor, we know that there are lots and lots of challenges out there, especially for construction firms. We're talking about inflation, higher interest rates, supply chain problems, and then this labor force availability problem that I'm going to talk more about. In terms of the forecast, I'm going to basically give you a picture from private economists that kind of give a half full, half empty kind of picture going forward. As we've been mentioning, there's this interactive survey. This is my ability to get some information from you about how things are going in the construction sector that I can tell President Kashkari about. I'm in front of this audience. They told me this about how things are going. There's never a limit on what we are interested in learning from businesses like you. So if you can take that survey, I would appreciate it. I'm going to go pretty fast. I'm going to give you lots of data. I'm going to give you lots of charts. Don't focus too much on any one chart because I'll be moving along, but I'm going to be sharing this PowerPoint afterwards, including some of the survey results, so you can take a closer look at it afterwards.
And if you guys have questions while we're going on, just feel free to type them in, and if they're relevant to the topic, by all means, we will bring them up.
Yep, I'm happy to take questions as they come up. Okay, so on to the data show. So first, let's take a real big 30,000 foot look. I think most people are familiar with this term, gross domestic product. Basically, it is a measure of total output adjusted for inflation. So it is a very broad measure, but we think it's a pretty decent one. Again, if we're just trying to assess overall economic conditions. So the things I would point you to, we know that there's a pretty decent recovery after the big drop. More recently, this year in 2022, quarter one and quarter two were negative. Obviously, not good news. Negative both for the U.S. and for Minnesota. I usually include Wisconsin in a lot of these charts, in part because it gives us another state barometer to kind of compare. And the other thing I'll note is that a lot of the charts that I do, I index. And what do I mean by that? So I can't compare Minnesota and the U.S. On an equal level. So what I have to do basically is compare them and compare their rate of change. So what I do is tie the first date to 100, and then all that the rest of the chart is the rate of change over time. Okay, that allows me to compare differently sized things to each other. And what you see here is that Minnesota and Wisconsin have taken slightly different paths, but are kind of in the same spot right now. And both states are growing more slowly than the US overall. The good news, the good recent news is that after two negative quarters, the third quarter came out recently, 2.6% growth. I do expect that to get revised. I'm not sure up or down. So I would generally say we're seeing modest growth, probably regardless of where the revision goes. We saw modest growth in the third quarter, which is certainly better than the previous two. And I would expect Minnesota and Wisconsin, because they've generally followed the same pattern, but little bit below. I would expect when state figures come out that Q3 was also positive at the state level. In terms of unemployment, I think people are pretty familiar. It's a really tight labor market.
Hey, Ron,
But yeah,
could you tip your mic up just a little bit?
absolutely. Is that better?
That's better. Thank you.
Great. So unemployment, I think people are familiar with the fact that it's very low. I don't know that they're familiar with the fact that it's about 50% lower, or excuse me, a third lower, 1 full point lower than it was pre-pandemic. So we're at about 2%. We have the lowest unemployment in the nation right now. That's very good news. The one thing I do always want to remind audiences, though, is that it's not benefiting everybody. So Black and Native American unemployment still around 6%. Okay. And especially as we talk more about labor availability, I think we have to start getting a little bit more serious about what we can do to really address some of those kind of systemic disparities between races in terms of unemployment. The other thing, though, despite the fact that we have such low unemployment, we are still not back to pre-pandemic total employment. So there are still fewer people employed right now than there were before the pandemic. In general, if you were to look at the overall trajectory of the last year and a half or so, it's actually quite strong job growth. I don't know if anyone's been reading the news. They just released the state figure for October employment in Minnesota, 17,000 more jobs. That's a really big number. And so we're getting closer to pre-pandemic employment, but we're still not there. And we had been taking kind of a much slower trajectory than the nation overall. Total construction employment, there's, I think, generally good news here. I give the whole timeline back to 2005 just to offer a little bit of context on where we are in the construction market right now. So everyone's familiar with what happened in the Great Recession to construction. You saw a much bigger decline in total output and total employment, both in the U.S. and in Minnesota. So really, the bottom was about 2010, and it's been climbing ever since. On the right part of the chart, you do see that dip in 2020. The U.S. has taken a little bit slower trajectory to get back, but it is also back to pre-pandemic levels, a little bit above, as is Minnesota. The thing that's interesting to me is that we've only now gotten back to 2005 levels. Now, I think we all could agree that that was probably hyperinflated to begin with in terms of what was going on in the construction market in 2005. So I actually see this as a much more balanced kind of construction employment market to begin with. In terms of breaking that construction employment down, I thought I'd just give a real quick picture of the different segments. Now, this is how the government kind of splits out the 4 biggest areas of employment. I don't necessarily know that I would split it out like this, but from a data standpoint, I thought this would be useful for you to see. Specialty trade, I believe, is about 65% of all employment as the government counts it, and it's been seeing some reasonable growth. Residential seen very significant growth during the pandemic. I expect coming figures to start trending down more in that. And then you have the other two that have seen maybe less of a bounce back than the other 2 sectors. And again, I would probably expect to see some specialty trade also be affected by the related dip that we're seeing in housing. So this is where, Dan, if you can get one of the questions ready, this is where I'm hoping I can get some input. This would be the question that you would be taking for me if the technology was working right. But I think Dan's going to show you what you all said on how recent business is going.
Yeah. So that link that's scrolling at the bottom of the screen, please take a minute to type that in, or the link is in the sidebar over here. And please take the survey. We only got 6 results so far. So come on, guys.
Okay. Well, and maybe what I will do is rather than pause on those if we don't have many respondents, actually, I'll just maybe cycle through, and then I can share those results in the PowerPoint itself, and they'll be in the right spot in the presentation that you can have that context at least. Does that make sense?
That's fine. Yep.
Okay. All right. So then I'm also interested in project backlog. What I can tell you is that this seems to be going down right now. Let me talk a little bit more about what's going on though in terms of from a data standpoint. So we obviously collect a lot of data at the Minneapolis Fed. Um, I'm always trying to get as much information as I can to give me insights on different things. One of the things we get is Dodge data, and I'm showing you the most recent data that I have up to September in terms of value of construction starts. And it's in three different categories that equal total construction value. And there's kind of good news and bad news. Construction spending does seem to be holding up despite fair number of challenges. I think we have to acknowledge that inflation probably helps the overall spending trend because every project is more expensive because of inflation. I think that has helped buoy overall spending tracking a little bit. If you look at the very right of the screen, it does look like things are coming down. That's not unusual. I do a 6-month rolling average to get out some of the seasonality in the data, but not all of it. So you tend to see a slight decline about now. So that's not unusual. I would say some of the other indicators that I'll talk about. So I'm kind of interested slash worried about whether or not this might see a little bit more steeper decline than we've been seeing in the last couple of years. One of the areas that I think everyone's familiar with that had been seeing very significant growth over the last several years is housing. The chart on the right is for single family and multifamily. There's kind of I wouldn't say a good, bad, but there's kind of two ways to think about that chart. There has been cleared pullback in the single family, but even at this year, we will still have built more than we did in the middle of the last decade. So that's, kind of a good thing, bad thing. We hope that doesn't last too long in terms of the slowdown. I think multifamily shows some signs of real strength in terms of some of my contacts suggest, the fact that single family building is falling back. That actually is really going to be a good incentive for developers to continue building multifamily because they'll be more in demand. So I'm interested in kind of watching those. I think it's very clear to me that we were underbuilt by a fairly significant margin. So I hold out hope that we can continue to see a lot more units in housing
Well,
going
yeah,
forward.
I always ask that question. How long can they keep building these massive apartment buildings? I mean,
You
everywhere
know,
you go, it's
yeah.
just like they're everywhere.
The only thing I can tell you about that, Dan, is if you look at the um, historical figures, um, what 2010 represented was a real trough in long-term kinds of building in terms of population growth and household formation.
Okay.
So it looks like we've been increasing a lot, but if you look at the longer trend over 30 or 40 years, 2010 literally looks like the bottom fell out of it, and we've been kind of chasing that tail ever since in terms of trying to get more supply into the market. I think all you have to do is look at both rent rates and new home sale prices and existing home prices, all of which have been inflated. So that to me really is as good an indicator as any that we're not overbuilding anything right now.
Boy, I always worry about how everybody can afford all the stuff that's going on. The
I
apartment rents,
I
the home prices. I mean, geez,
My son happens to be looking for an apartment in Minneapolis right now, and he's got a lot of sticker shock right now. That's what I can tell you.
I can
Um,
admit.
So one of the other things that we do, and some of you have maybe taken this survey because Nari is now one of our partners, and I appreciate that. We do a construction survey twice a year to give us a better sense on what's happening in our 6-state region. So for those that don't know, we have a territory that runs from western Wisconsin and the UP of Michigan, Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Montana. And we're trying to always track that as best we can. We have a survey out in that 6-state region. Survey actually closes today. If anyone's interested in taking that survey, I'd be happy to forward a link. I should have thought about that before this and had it in your box. But it closes today. We're going to have about 300 respondents, which I'm pretty happy about. I'm going to give you just a sneak peek on some of the unofficial results that I have. Please, I would ask that you not share as I haven't released these publicly. So this is kind of a sneak peek just for this audience. So generally, what I'm seeing right now in the survey that was just out, literally still out right now, is that revenues seem to have maintained somewhat. It's kind of what some of the data that I showed you before is. Profits, though, have shrunk much more clearly. Not surprising given that we have inflation and there's just lots of other challenges in the economy right now. Firms seem to be eating into their project backlogs. That's what seems to be keeping revenues up because backlogs in general, the survey respondents are saying that their project backlogs have shrunk. More projects are also being canceled, according to this survey. And delays, we've seen that really since the start of the pandemic, that delays aren't necessarily getting any worse, but they're just problematic across the board. New projects out for bid also was probably one of the things I'm going to have to take a closer look at to make sure I'm seeing the data right. But it kind of looks like new projects, survey respondents are saying there aren't as many projects out for bid as there was the same time last year. The outlook, I don't want to call this the glass half full, but given all of the results that I've kind of glanced over so far, I expected the outlook to actually be more pessimistic than it is. It's slightly net negative, but it's actually I don't want to call it resilient, but it's a little bit better than I might have otherwise expected. And in general, on this, residential housing respondents tend to be seeing a lot tougher conditions, and they're kind of pulling the overall sentiment lower. So let's talk about challenges. So that's kind of the picture right now of what some of the activity is. I think everyone's familiar with what some of these challenges are. This is actually from this November survey. This is we ask businesses, what are the two greatest challenges your business faces, and it has really been the top three for the last 2 years. Material input cost inflation, labor availability, and supply chain disruptions. I'm going to talk a little bit more about all three, a little bit less about supply chain disruptions. We have been hearing that those have been improving. I have one of the questions in that survey that Dan put up is on that. I really would like your opinion on that. There seems to be some suggestion that maybe because of the slowdown, maybe because of other factors, the supply chain problem is improving somewhat, but I'd love to get your input on all of the questions in that survey, actually. So let's take a look at a couple of the individual challenges. And I think inflation is really the important one, especially for this group. You've been experiencing inflation for much longer, and in especially recently, I think more steeply than other sectors. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time kind of giving you a thought, giving you some input on how the Fed thinks about inflation. So the first thing I want to discuss is this idea of consumer price index versus the personal consumption expenditure. Why do I want to talk about that? They're really they're two egg-heady kinds of indexes about prices. The reason I want to talk about these is the consumer price index is the inflation index that you read about when you're on your phone reading about the news and the economy. And so you see that line on this chart is the very top line. It's really high, between 8 and 9% recently, way higher than we would hope. So what the consumer price index is it's a standard basket of goods that is held constant month to month. So it's got eggs, it's got cheese, it's got beef in it. Then we price it in November, and then we go to December and we price exactly the same basket of goods. So that gives us the measure on how prices have changed. Makes very good sense, actually. But the personal consumption expenditure is an index that the Fed prefers because it's the CPI but allows for substitution. And what do I mean by that? So when you or I are out shopping, say I'm out shopping for my eggs and cheese and beef, but I've noticed that beef has gotten really expensive, and it has been. So I'm going to substitute chicken into my basket instead. Now, chicken is a lot cheaper than beef, so what CPE is, excuse me, PCE is a better household measure of inflation, of real inflation, because businesses substitute goods all the time, households substitute goods all the time based on pricing. And so we think that's a better measure of household and business inflation kind of in the real world. Now, what I will tell you is that it is also unacceptably high. There's two measures here on this chart. We have headline or total, and that's very inflated, between 6 and 7%. And then I also put on there PCE core. You might hear about this too with the consumer price index, about core inflation. And basically that's everything minus food and energy, because those two tend to be the most volatile. So in terms of trying to get a better idea of maybe what's happening outside of those two volatile areas, we look at core. Even that one, though, is much more elevated than we would hope. Now, not all goods and services and other things in those measures are all created equal. And I wanted to talk a little bit about where we're seeing more inflation versus less inflation. So let me talk a little bit first about kind of how we got into this inflationary environment. So I think everyone's familiar with the fact that when we got locked down in the pandemic, there was this big shift to goods, especially durable goods. Durable goods being those things that are expected to last 12 months or longer. Non-durable, less than 12 less than 12 months. So we started buying more TVs, we started buying more couches for our house, we started making our houses nicer because we were spending more time in them, and we had this flood of demand into goods. And what happened is we had a lot of shortages. I think the shortages that you're still seeing today that we're still trying to work through. And this was really compounded by the fact that we also, because of COVID's impact on labor, we started having a compounding effect from supply chains, not only in a supply chain delivery, but also in a production sense. So we really have been trying to do double time in trying to make up for this shortage of goods. That's why we've seen prices spike up so high, especially in durable goods. Now we are starting to see a slow rebalancing of that demand back to services. It's also why you're starting to see more inflation now in services because we're starting to demand some more of those particular items. Okay, so inflation for services right now, I would say is moderate, but it's growing. Inflation for goods, it's still very high, but the good news is that it's at least stabilizing. That's at least one of the things that the Fed has been trying to do is at least start setting a better pattern so businesses and consumers knew what to expect going forward. Everyone knows in this audience, the in terms of construction materials, those have been going up. If you're not familiar, Mortenson Construction has a couple of really nice indexes, and here you can see how Minneapolis compares to the nation as a whole. Minneapolis being a little bit better, but still really bad. And then over on the right, just individual product markets also significantly high. So if you went back roughly about a year ago, it was just kind of straight up. And since then, there's been a little bit of flattening on some items, still some volatility in others, but all still very elevated.
Hmm.
So why exactly did the Fed wait so long? I'm sure some of you have that question. I think it's a very valid question and a very valid critique of monetary policy. So I'm going to explain kind of what some of the thinking has been in terms of why we decided to act when we did. And I'm going to start with a quote that President Kashkari gave back in March of this year, actually a couple of months before I first met Dan. And he said back then, when inflation accelerated last year, I argued it was likely due to transitory factors which would soon pass, and that hasn't happened. Okay. I think part of the thinking by the Federal Reserve, and I don't think we were alone in this thinking, is that we expected the vaccine to have a very notable impact on labor. And labor in the sense of relieving pressure on production and supply chains and on wages, which were starting to really grow. And basically, that didn't happen. We also didn't expect for COVID, given the vaccine, we didn't expect COVID to be still a global disruptor. We didn't expect to see the surges, and we're still seeing the surges now, maybe not to this same extent here in the US, but if you look at what's happening in China, as long as China is pursuing the policies that it is and having the lockdowns that it is, supply chains are going to be problematic, at least to some degree. I think the other thing, COVID isn't necessarily a health problem anymore. I don't want to minimize it either, but I think from an economy standpoint, it has become a workplace disruptor. And as long as it is a workplace disruptor, we're going to still have some issues with it. The Ukraine war was certainly unexpected, especially in March of 2021 when the vaccines were coming out, and that has really played havoc with the most volatile parts of the price indexes that we follow. And then the other thing is that we frankly didn't expect consumer demand to stay as elevated as it has. Now, yes, we can talk about the effect of stimulus and other things, but even after we would have expected those to kind of run out in budgets, we've really seen continued elevated consumer demand that we didn't expect. And there's some good news as it relates to that, and that is a lot of it is from rising disposable income. We are seeing wages increase. That's good for workers. I'm sure there's a lot of people listening here that are business owners, and it's not good for you. And I think we have to acknowledge that it's a good bad situation. But in terms of inflation, it has really held the floor underneath prices that we didn't expect. That is why we have done 5 rate increases. For those that maybe aren't following very closely, we started with 5 basis points um, in March, and then we've done successive increases and increasingly larger ones the last 5 FOMC meetings. What I want to tell this audience is that we do expect rates to rise further. We don't know how much, but the Federal Reserve is very committed to bringing inflation down. unfortunately, we've been in a situation where we haven't yet seen significant impacts on labor markets. Now, that's kind of a good bad thing. If labor markets continue and wages continue to be very high, that's itself a little bit of a problem, but it's a better problem than seeing demand go down and employment go down. That's kind of the double edge effect, and we're trying to avoid that. So far, employment really has been quite strong. So that's frankly something that we're hoping to see, and we're hoping continues. So here, this is normally where I would ask you about some inflation impacts. I'm still very interested in getting those, and I'll include them in my PowerPoint when I share. I'm also, as I mentioned, interested in supply chain. So if you could give me some insights on those, I would also appreciate it. But right now, I'm going to talk about labor markets. So this will kind of be the last general area. I should be done in 5 or 10 minutes or so to leave some time for questions. And again, if anyone has questions while I'm going here, happy to stop and address those as I go. So one of the things that has surprised us, as I've been talking about, has been job growth. Well, the reason is that we've seen very, very persistent job openings. They have recovered well above what they were pre-pandemic, their levels from pre-pandemic. So there's kind of two ways to think about the current trend. So if we only needed to get above 100, we're still well above that. However, we have seen recent very steep declines in job openings. Now it hasn't come through in terms of when I'm out asking, are you hiring? I am still hearing almost about the same percentage of firms that are hiring. What I think might be happening is they may be peeling back a little bit on the number of people that they're looking for. But generally speaking, I still see the job openings circumstances as really quite positive. Let me give you a little bit better idea of kind of give you a better summary of the whole labor market and some of its dynamics. If you're not familiar, there's this survey by the Bureau of Labor Statistics called the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, or JOLTS. I'm going to go through each of these lines and kind of explain a different part of the labor market. So hiring demand, that's you all hiring, still really strong. That's the top line that I just showed you, and you can see that recent decline. Okay, actual hires, that's the next line down, the brown line, is much flatter. It's positive. Okay, so we're still seeing job growth, but it's much flatter than job openings. And that really is kind of the labor conundrum. That's also the opportunity, that's the missed opportunity in the economy as well in terms of growth. The most interesting line to me right now, and something that we don't have a great handle on, is voluntary quits. That's the red line. So it is systematically higher. It's flattened out, but at a rate and a level that is higher than it was pre-pandemic. And it doesn't look like it on this chart, but if I were to show it only as its own line and kind of high and give it a little bit more room to breathe, you would see that this rate is significantly higher than it was pre-pandemic. And then you have the last. Yes,
Can you
yes,
talk?
sir.
Can you talk about that a little bit? What's causing? Do you have any idea what's causing the voluntary quits?
I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end.
Okay.
Maybe what would be best, let me save that for the end because I do have a slide on that fairly shortly. And if there's anything that people want to follow up on, maybe that I didn't address, I'd be happy to continue talking about it because it's one of my favorite topics. The short answer to that is we don't have a great idea. So I'll give you some ideas, but it's something we're still working on. So layoffs are low and generally stable. That's mostly because we have so much trouble finding workers and keeping them to begin with. That's why employers are probably more likely to keep a less productive employee than they would prefer. They don't know what's on the other side of the job market as to whether or not they can replace that person. Generally speaking, as I mentioned, that's really a lot. This shows you that there's missed economic growth opportunities. So again, labor conditions in our survey, hiring demand has really continued to be robust. Roughly 40% of firms are looking to increase their total headcount. There's a growing share looking to replace rising turnover. That's the quits thing. Wages have been increasing steadily. Let me show you a quick chart on that. This is surveys, the construction survey going back to October 2020. I don't have the recent survey in here, but what you can see is more firms are giving raises, more firms are giving bigger raises. And the most recent survey suggests there might be some slight softening in wage expectations for this most recent survey. I would not call it a drop off by a big drop off, but maybe a little bit of softening. So I'm going to move on from that. So other employer responses to labor. So aside from raising wages, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but we are increasingly interested on what firms are doing to try to attract labor. We know you're doing lots of different things. What we're trying to figure out is how much market penetration is any one thing, and is it having an impact on drawing people in? Not only drawing them from other businesses, but drawing them in if they weren't working in the first place, because labor force participation is really important. Okay, so why? Why is the labor market so tight? Real quickly on two things. The labor force itself, the size of the labor force, that's the number that are employed or looking for work, has really flattened out, not only in Minnesota, but across the nation. If you look at Wisconsin, even worse. Generally, about 2000, the labor force really started to take a different trend line. And mostly that's because we're seeing a slower population growth. We have declining fertility. There's also immigration and migration issues that are lower than they were in the 1990s. We're also seeing lower labor force participation. I'll talk a little bit again in the next chart, but there's generally an aging population and some other factors that I'll talk about that that question kind of alluded to. So labor force participation, again, if you go roughly about 2000, it has been steadily declining in all of the states and across the nation here. The good news for Minnesota is it has a much higher than average labor force participation. In other words, among the eligible people to work, how many actually work? So it sees a larger percentage, especially than the U.S., but even Wisconsin. The problem is it's been going down, and we've seen about a 2% drop just during the pandemic, and that is not likely to return quickly. Why is that? So here's where I said I would address this a little bit. So we do know that we expected some of the decline in labor force participation because of the baby boom generation. As you get older, you are more likely to retire, and that has actually happened. Okay. I think there has also been a pandemic reevaluation of work. For example, what we have learned because of problems like childcare is I think there are a number of two-income families that simply decided to be one-income families and have a saner life. In part because the supply of daycare has shrunk slightly. It has also gotten more expensive. So I think more households were saying that extra income or even that first income maybe is not worth getting a $14 an hour job to simply transfer it to childcare. And there are lots of other, I think, issues going on in terms of people seeing opportunity and leaving current jobs for what they think are better jobs. So we do also know that they're leaving the labor force at all ages. The other thing that we're trying to get a better handle on is we think entrepreneurship and gig work might be having some play here in terms of the number of workers that are available. The problem is, oh, sorry, before I go there, the problem with this one is that we don't have very good measures of entrepreneurship and especially gig work. And the data that I could share also, I could add on to this presentation if you wanted. Most of the measures that we have for gig work do not suggest that it has exploded like it seems to, like I think the popular impression of it is. I would say we don't have great measures of it, but the ones that we do don't suggest. We've always had the side hustles. I don't know that we've had a proportionately or exponentially larger share of side hustles than we used to in the past. And then we know there are lots of work disincentives. There are benefit cliffs for people that get government assistance that might prevent them from either taking work without losing those benefits, which is an obstacle that I think we need to spend some time thinking about. In general, we've done some survey work on the labor force that suggests there are just a lot of obstacles at the personal and household level that keep them from taking jobs. We also know that employers have to share in some of the responsibility and maybe not presenting a job market that those people want to go into. They may have low pay, they may not have a great schedule, other things. We also hear about a lot of workers simply not getting responded to when they apply to jobs. And then there's this last bucket that I kind of just generally put down to environment. It's where job matching happens. And that is things like affordable housing, affordable daycare. It's not necessarily the worker's fault and certainly not the employer's fault that someone can't find affordable daycare, but it is something that is an obstacle to that job actually being matched, the labor matching with the job opportunity. So we're going to have to spend, I think, a little bit we're going to have to get our hands dirty on how we actually fix some of those obstacles.
Bill had a question.
Yes.
Here there's 7 million quits. Is that true?
I haven't looked at that data. That sounds a little bit high, but not overly. I don't know exactly what that number is. I'd be happy to look into it.
Okay.
Lastly, I do want your outlook, again, going back to the survey that Dan has made available. I'm interested in your outlook because that's really important to us. But what I'm going to finish with here is this is what we get a report called the Blue Chip Financial Forecasts. And what it is it is a summary of 50 or 55 of the best economic shops in the country. And they essentially aggregate all of those surveys and then put out a summary, a consensus summary of what they all say. And so the left chart shows, if you look at the blue bars, in the shaded areas, the forecast. So they are expecting very small GDP growth in the coming Q1, and then a very slight negative growth in Q2 and Q3, and then from there an upward trend in GDP. So clearly not good news for the next couple of quarters. That's what their forecast is. But I would also say, given the circumstances, I think things could be significantly worse than that. Going over to the right, the one that I find maybe a little bit more reassuring, or at least hopeful, maybe is a better word, because it's a forecast, so we don't know, is that private forecasters really expect what the Fed is doing to get a hold of inflation. So by the time we hit this time next year, that we will have seen a significant decline in both the CPI index and the PCE index. And I think that ultimately is really going to lead to, I think, stability in the economy and kind of, maybe, I don't want to say return to normal, because with the pandemic, there is no such thing. It's a new normal, but I think that's hopefully good news if we actually go there. So just some real final thoughts. Again, from my standpoint, I think growth, it looks like it's likely to be modest at best. And I think we have to acknowledge that there's more potential to the downside right now. Construction and real estate is taking the brunt of higher interest rates right now, and we want to acknowledge that. As the Fed, we know that what we're doing is probably affecting your industry more than any. The challenge is, even before the interest rate challenge, we knew that there are many others, and they're sticking with us longer than we hoped. My message to you is that I do think labor is going to stick with us, even when we get on top of the inflation thing, supply chains start to iron out, labor is going to continue to hang with us. So I think our ability to rethink what work is and how we attract people is going to have to continue to evolve. I do think there's some room for optimism, though. We are seeing really persistent job growth. I think job growth that we really haven't expected to be as robust as it has been. And private markets are believing that inflation is going to get reined in. So I'm really positive about that. And in general, I talk to a lot of businesses, and the thing that I have seen repeatedly throughout the last 2.5 years is resilience. There have been so many challenges in this economy, and I continue to see businesses rise to that challenge and find a way around it, find a way through it. And for all of you listening, I wish you luck. And I appreciate the efforts that you do to keep people employed and to keep the economy going.
Cool.
I appreciate the opportunity to come and present to this group. I'm happy to take questions for as long as you have any.
Yeah, thanks. That was really interesting.
And if you can stop my share, Dan, that probably would be fine too.
Sure. Hang on
I'm missing the button here. Oh, there. Hang on. Okay.
Yep, I got it. So
All right, great.
we're just seeing the screen now. So you guys got any questions? Robin?
That was great.
Okay.
That was absolutely fabulous. So you're being a little bit more optimistic that we're not going to be heading into a recession.
I can't tell you that. That's way above my pay grade. What I would tell you is that we have, given the circumstances, I'm pretty happy not happy, that's the wrong word. I think the circumstances have been very challenging, and we look like we look like we could get on the other side of this in better condition than I might have otherwise expected. But I don't want to say, and again, recession is a tough thing. So let me go back to the very first slide that I presented. Net growth was negative for 2 quarters. That in itself doesn't mean we were in recession, because recession, as it's defined by the group that does it, the National Bureau of Economic Research, they tend to look at lots of other factors as well, including employment, and employment has remained very positive. So technically, we have not in this recent period been in been in recession. Now, what I will tell you is that is a very common and I think reasonable assessment that if GDP is going down, that's recession. I think that's fair. What I generally tell people is if you're a Republican, that's a recession. If you're a Democrat, that's not a recession. So it's really kind of what is your interpretation of how things are. I think we can say for sure, I think we can probably agree, conditions aren't great right now. But conditions there, I do think there are some underlying strengths that I hope stay with us. And if they do, maybe we can avoid recession. But I really can't say that that is going to happen.
This is more of a statement than a question. Do you want to respond to that?
I'm sorry. Hang on here.
He's not. I don't know if
You can't see it.
that.
It says,
hang
I'm a builder. This
Got
is
it.
from John.
Okay. Yep. I'm up now.
I'm a builder land developer for the past 35 years and never seen the market shut off so fast. Buyers will not buy when they've seen 4% rates and now 7+. The big chill is coming.
I definitely hear that. I can't deny that. The only thing I would say is, and I would kind of go back to the chart that I gave you on construction employment. And if you think about what happened in the Great Recession, we have a long way to go before we hit those levels. Now, that's not good news for those that are experiencing more pain, acknowledged. And the higher interest rates are clearly falling headfirst into the housing market. Absolutely. What I would say is I think part of it is a readjustment to what expensive credit really is. You know, a lot of people in this room probably have had significantly higher mortgage rates than the 7%. I have. It was my very first one. It was above 7%. I think some, maybe from the 80s here, you can remember a first mortgage at 18%. So
I remember when 12% was a great rate.
Yeah, I had 11%.
Right.
Yeah, I think people are spoiled right now.
And I do think if there's one thing that might happen is it might put, I don't want to say a lid, but I think we might start seeing home prices moderate a little bit because we have to start figuring in finance costs more directly when rates are a little bit higher. So I don't want to say I will not tell you that higher rates are a good thing. What I would say is that the cost of credit still is, historically speaking, relatively, it's not cheap, but it's closer to what cheap was.
Just to interject my own experience in my area,
please.
Is I've had a
Renee's
bunch
in California.
In California, in the 40-year-old bracket where people have been saving up to buy homes for the last 5 years and they don't have cash, and the cash buyers are taking the inventory. Now that the interest rates raised, we just have a little gap in the market. The cash buyers are going to pull back, and some of these first-time home buyers are going to start stepping forward. Is my take on it. So
I appreciate that
experience.
I am curious. You said you're in California.
Yeah.
I am curious. Are you hearing any word on more basically investors plowing back into the single-family market? Basically, especially if prices go up, or I'm sorry, especially if prices kind of flatten, maybe go down. Do you expect more investor involvement there?
I would tell you that my cell phone says yes.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I get 50 offers a week.
Wow. Any other questions?
Let's take a minute. We'll run through the slides real quick. There's 11 answers, but still interesting. Recent business. How's general business activity been doing? I did this quick. So much higher. So again, positive on the top. How's your current project backlog? I talked to someone yesterday that they're booked out till 2025. That's kind of a rarity, but
I can say, Dan, what I have seen is a lot of lumpiness, is what I would call it. It doesn't seem like everybody's experience. Seems like there's a lot of different experiences in the market. I haven't been able to look at the data close enough to see where that lumpiness might be hardest, but that's interesting.
And until they sign the contract, that's, it's not really, it's real, but it's not given that he's out there to 25.
Right.
So.
And this is, this affects designers dramatically because we're the first to come into the project. So that's kind of a big deal. What's the biggest challenge? Now, this should be a word cloud, but it didn't work in this account. Supply, understanding current market interest rates, quality subs, supply chain, backlog, availability of trades, recession, labor shortage. So I would have expected a few more labor shortages, but a lot of people on this call might be individual business owners that don't have employees. So it's hard to say. But for sure, all the contractors I talk to, that's always the number one thing that they mention. Can't find enough good help. Inflation, general directions in material and pricing, somewhat better, so
That's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean,
For anyone on the call, what have you been seeing decreases in? If things are getting a little bit better, if I understood that right, what is getting better? What materials?
Here, I'll just show you
Well,
one.
things are starting to deliver faster. It used to be that the high-end appliances were taking, oh my gosh, 15 months to get, but they're starting to deliver faster. I just had a whole Sub-Zero Wolf package deliver about 4 months faster than they originally estimated. So I think some of the manufacturing is starting to catch up a little bit.
Right.
Plumbing parts, I do kitchen and bath designing. So I'm not seeing such a shortage, but I do have friends who are still doing interior design, furnishings and stuff, and still finding slow labor getting furniture is still taking a little bit longer.
Yeah.
But I see we still are having a serious labor shortage.
Yeah.
Really a big labor shortage.
So pre-pandemic, $8-9 a sheet was pretty common, even less than that sometimes. During the pandemic, $40. So that's where this is, local company here. That's just one thing I like to look at. It's kind of fun.
Sure.
Anyway, but yeah, it's all over the board. I mean, I talked to the appliance people, and they're still talking about, if you're going to order a range or something like that, that parts that they needed to finish that are still not done. So they're, 6 months, 9 months, a year out on some of those kinds of things. But they said it's getting better, but yeah, still an issue. Supply chains, that's what we were just talking about the same. So that hasn't changed much. Labor shortage been getting better or worse? Okay. Yeah. I don't see anybody jumping up and down saying it's wonderful. And that you said
there's the money question. I'm interested in that one for sure.
You said a really good comment. I made some notes on that. It's just the way we hire people needs to evolve into a little bit better or different way than it's been done in the past. So how do you attract the right people for your business? And the key word being attract. That's what I think a lot of people really need to start taking a hard look at.
And I think the my impression of the construction industry is it's a sectoral issue and it's an individual business issue. Everyone here knows that the long-term trends in terms of people attracted to the construction sector has been has gone down slowly, and I think the industry really started paying attention to that 5, 6, 8 years ago, and hopefully some of that momentum is starting to maybe shift our overall impressions of what a career in construction can be. But it's going to have to continue that, I think, to really start addressing as you all are familiar with, the pandemic didn't create the labor shortage in construction. It was there well before that. And I think the hope is that it can transition, because there are so many good careers for lots of people, and hopefully also address some of the systemic issues we have in terms of getting people into good jobs and career jobs versus just jobs.
Yeah.
I had a continuing ed class back in the late 90s, and the instructor told us that they put a survey out there of different professions, different jobs you could do, of a list of 100. The bottom was being a cowboy, and the next one up was working in construction.
Yeah. All right.
It's crazy.
So,
I'd rather be a cowboy.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, optimism, about half and half.
Yep.
So that's probably to be expected. And was that the last one? Yeah, that was the last.
That is the last one. Yes.
Yep.
I appreciate you sharing those, Dan.
Yeah, cool. And I'm going to keep this survey going. So if you're watching the recording, I'm going to keep that link up for a while. Please fill it in, and I will let you guys know. I'll probably send an email or out here something after a few weeks and just let you know the results. So I think it's really interesting. This is a great questions.
I appreciate that. I appreciate you getting this, especially given the technical difficulties we were having, Dan. I appreciate you getting this up in very short notice.
No problem. My pleasure. So cool. Anybody got anything else you want to add?
I have a few questions.
Yes.
I think you kind of answered this for me, but first off, what are those that aren't working, that are not, the job market was high. What are they doing to survive and meet their goals? And the other question along with that was, how are people like us that are working for ourselves counted in your data?
Two good questions, and I will hopefully be able to address both of them. I'll take the last one first. In terms of people who are working for themselves, there's a couple of different databases. One called non-employers and and a different one sole proprietors. So they are counted. The problem is we don't necessarily have great measures and near-term measures of either of those, because you got to go into IRS data, and IRS doesn't like to share a lot of data. So we don't have a good current picture of either of those. We know that during the economy, we do have pretty good measures of new business interests, like people that take out new employer identification numbers. Those got really elevated and now are at a fundamentally higher level than they were pre-pandemic. We do think that's part of what's going on. We just don't have a great way of really assessing it. In terms of the people, in terms of like who was working when labor force participation was really high, at least if I understand your question, where have they gone now because participation is lower? Part of it is retirement. So it went high when we had women. It really started going much higher in the 70s and 80s as women started to enter the labor force in much greater numbers. So in the 90s, we kind of hit peak because baby boomers also were that bubble going through the system. And now as they get older, we've seen what we expected, at least some decline in that, but we have seen more decline than retirements would suggest. And that frankly, it's one of the problem areas that we don't have good answers on, in part because we don't have ways of measuring or talking consistently to people who aren't working. We have really good ability to track firms because there's transaction there. Whether it be income reporting or other things, we generally have a very good pulse on what is happening at the business level. When it comes to workers, if you are looking for work, we only have very little information on you. And if you're not looking for work at all, you are a black box to us. And that's one of the things that we're trying to get a better assessment on. Census is doing some interesting survey work around this. We're starting to get information, but in new survey tools, you tend to see a lot of volatility because we're trying to figure out what are the questions to ask, how do we get into people's inboxes and actually have them reply. So we don't, in my estimation, that's one of the things that we have to do a better job of figuring out. If you're not working, what will it take you to get working again? What is it that you are interested in? Do you need to have, do you need to have better pay? Does it need to be more flexible? Does it? We don't have a great assessment, in my opinion, on what exactly that means, what it's going to take.
Cool.
Okay.
That's good information. One more question. What do you think the hurricane, or let's just say natural disasters in general, is going to do to affect material supply?
Oh, I mean, I think anytime you have a surge in demand for things, that's going to create problems for everybody else who is already in the material need business.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that's going to be that's only going to exacerbate the problem, I think. I don't know how else I don't know how else you could think about it. Again,
Yeah.
it's when whole towns are literally obliterated, you can just imagine everyone knows what goes into one house, much less 100,000 new additional houses.
Can't even
So
begin.
it's just gonna the pig just got bigger without ever leaving the python, basically.
So I have a question regarding, the tech layoffs that are happening. How do you
Yeah.
think that's going to affect us?
That's a really interesting question. What I don't hear is a lot of nervousness among employers. I think there are some exceptions. and the tech world being one of them. I don't know enough about. We don't have enough insight to the tech industry um, to know whether or not this was expected. Um, I don't really generally see a lot of nervousness among other employers, mostly because there seems to be more fall-on effects from things like construction. So if construction were to really plummet by, magnitudes of order, that really has a bigger ripple, in my opinion. Whereas, if 10,000 people get laid off from Twitter, I'm not sure what the ripple effect is on that, aside from maybe other tech companies feeling like this is a wave they want to try to get ahead of. I think you have seen some fall on some follow-up announcements. I don't know if they're related. Wouldn't be surprised. But generally, I would go back to the numbers that I saw yesterday out of Minnesota. 17,000 jobs. I believe that is the biggest we've seen in a couple of years on a monthly basis.
Well,
So I'm not going to lie to you. I keep expecting a shoe to drop when it comes to job growth, and we just really haven't seen. There have been a couple of low months, but there haven't been any persistently low months. And we every now and then we get a surprise. Now, again, the 17,000 easily could get revised to, you know, 13, 12, 13. The methodology behind it is not perfect. So there are revisions, but I generally trust the direction of estimates. And, we just continue to see numbers that are very encouraging to me, even acknowledging some what I think are market shaking kinds of announcements by really big firms like Twitter, Meta, things like that.
So
Thank you.
bottom line, I think companies need to stay diligent with their marketing and their approaches they use to hire people.
Yep.
We don't need to run for the hills right now. I think we're okay there, right? So we'll just keep pushing forward and yeah, cool.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
What's a good place or good resources for a layman like me to go and find information like you presented to us for my region, my state? What are good resources for that?
Sure. First, I would say you could go to minneapolisfed.org, so our website. We have what we call a regional economic indicators page that you can basically click in we have a 6-day region. We have measures where you can see for things like employment, GDP, other measures that you might be interested, job openings. That's a resource, I think, and a quick resource for people that are interested. Otherwise, state labor market offices. So the Department of Employment and Economic Development for Minnesota, a wonderful, probably one of the best labor market offices among states that I follow and that I get information from. Those would be the first two that I would talk. And then Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is the federal level, also offers a wealth of data for anyone interested in kind of digging in with a little bit more detail on what's happening.
I would assume every state has a website like this, right? Like the Minnesota Fed. So if you type
exactly
your
right.
state, fed.org, you find out information about your state. So I've always found too that I haven't done it for a long time, but census reports.
Yep.
I found always very fascinating, very interesting for looking up statistics and
I was just going to say, Dan, when I share this PowerPoint, my email address will be on at the end. Anyone ever has some information interest, I'm always happy to help folks out that are in the industry and want better information.
Cool. All right. I think we're done about 3 minutes ago. So
I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with everyone today. Great questions. And I appreciate your tolerance for some technical difficulties today.
Thanks, Ron. I'm going to end the broadcast. You can stay on, Ron, if you want. So thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week or next time. And we've got some cool guests coming up. So hang with us. See you guys.
Have a great day, everyone.
Yeah.